So Putin's war economy continues to face mounting pressure, growing signs of cracks as Ukraine continues its remarkable strikes across various oil refineries, but also because of Russia's shadow economy at sea, which is spiraling in ways the Kremlin will not admit. In just the past 2 years, Moscow has multiplied its fleet of covert oil tankers several times over. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil carriers now sail in the shadows, many of them rust bucket vessels, 20 plus years old, uninsured, and invisible to regulators. This isn't just a dark workaround to sanctions, it's the birth of a dark shipping empire that could, in some people's views, outlast the war itself. Officials in Europe say more than 440 of these ships are already sanctioned, yet the fleet keeps growing. And whilst the West is trying to see ways that it can impose greater price caps, Russia is still somehow raking in billions by sending oil halfway across the world via India and China. What was supposed to strangle Moscow, therefore, has instead built a vast illicit economy on the high seas. Therefore, in this video, I wanted to break down how sanctions created this shadow fleet, why it's become a very dangerous and seemingly overlooked loophole, and what it could mean for a global trade issue long after the war in Ukraine. Stick with me until the end, because the West's options for closing these gaps are fewer, but also riskier than you might realize.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where we are exploring an unusual but I think quite fascinating angle to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Now, to understand what's happening today, we need to take a step back. The idea of a shadow fleet or dark fleet, if you've ever heard these terms in the mainstream media, isn't really new. For decades, states like Iran, Venezuela have relied on old, poorly maintained tankers with opaque ownership to keep their oil exports flowing under sanctions. These vessels often hide behind flags of convenience, operate without proper insurance, and use deceptive shipping practices to stay in business. But I'm curious what you think. Is this something that is overlooked or overhyped? Let me know in the comments below about what could be done and why we should be doing something about it. But the idea of a dark fleet or shadow fleet has completely, expanded as Russia has taken this concept and scaled it up to a level the world has never seen. Before the war in Ukraine, the shadow fleet numbered only a couple hundred ships. Since 2022, it has multiplied multiple times over, becoming a parallel system of global energy trade that now rivals legitimate networks in size and scope. From the beginning of Putin's full-scale invasion, many Western states turned to economic warfare, relying often on sanctions as the primary weapon of choice. Cut off Moscow's oil revenues, and you'll cut off its ability to wage the war. But of course, there is a catch. There are ways to sidestep sanctions. They are an imperfect mechanism. Oil markets don't stop because of new regulations. They simply reroute. And by late 2022, when Europe banned Russian seaborne oil imports, Moscow turned to two countries that have been on the channel quite a lot in this context, India and China. Shipping oil halfway around the world required more tankers. And with Western services banned, Russia scrambled for a workaround. Now, the solution has been crude, but effective. Build a shadow fleet. Hundreds of old tankers, sometimes 30, 40 years past their prime, have been snapped up by shell companies with murky ownership. They then fly flags from far-flung countries, operating with dodgy or no insurance and even then fake GPS signals. Estimates vary wildly because definitions differ, but some who track this more professionally and comprehensively put the fleet at roughly, nearly 1,000 ships. That's about 17% of all in-service oil tankers around the world. Others estimate 1,500 tankers, close to a fifth of the global fleet. And if you include more categories of what's known as dark tonnage and sanctioned affiliates, it keeps growing. And then that doesn't even count things like the smaller coastal tankers transporting Russian crude and products on just short hops, a few hours. These ships aren't risky, they're dangerous because a lack of insurance combined with really old vessels increases the risks of economic, environmental, and humanitarian catastrophes. So how does Russia largely get away with it? Well, it's tactics of evasion. By playing a sophisticated game of deception, ships spoof their locations, conduct ship-to-ship transfers in open waters, and then flag hop from one registry to another to avoid detection. By the time the oil reaches its buyer, therefore, there's just enough plausible deniability for traders to look the other way. The sanctions don't put them out of the business, they just put them out of legitimate business. Shipping is an incredibly complicated industry where one ship can have, insurance from one country but be owned by another, but be employed by another, but have the crew from another. It is truly a multinational entity. But one of the biggest problems with global news is that it's not just about what happened. It's about how it's framed, the narrative. Two outlets can cover the same event and leave you with completely different impressions. And if you're only reading from one perspective, then you miss half the story. Take Ukraine right now. President Zelensky has reiterated again that the current front lines should be the baseline for any future negotiations with Russia. And depending upon where you look, that single statement gets spun in completely different directions. On the one hand, in Western outlets, you'll see headlines framing it as Ukraine holding firm. However, on the other hand, from Russian state media, it's cast as a desperate concession. And even some European coverage presents it as a pragmatic step to keep talks alive. Same words, three very different realities. Now, that's exactly the kind of bias and framing you miss if you only stick to one news bubble. So that's why I use today's sponsor, Ground News. It pulls in thousands of outlets into one place, lets you compare headlines side by side, track political bias, and even my favorite feature, the blind spot, covering stories that the left, right, or international press aren't covering at all. It's a game changer if you want to cut through the spin and see the bigger picture, which if you're a regular here will know mirrors my own mission on this channel, to engage with perspectives across the spectrum, rather than being trapped in a single unidimensional narrative. You can check it out at ground.news/Pyotr, and with my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. I'll leave the link in the description and pinned comment so you can really check it out for yourself. So after years of rapid expansion, the pace now is easing. Dozens of tankers have joined the shadow fleet so far this year, compared with hundreds in previous years, as the toughest Western sanctions yet make it harder still to find suitable vessels and willing service providers. The point being that over time the sanctions begin to compound, and this is where it might be getting to a head even for Putin's, attempted workarounds. For example, in July, the EU and the UK rolled out further sanctions, combined with US restrictions. So more than 450 shadow fleet tankers now face sanctions, many of them vessels Moscow needs to lift that crude to its biggest buyers, namely China and India. Regulators are increasingly closing the net, it seems, but even so, the economics do remain compelling. What I mean by that is that, for example, the G7 price cap adds layers of friction and compliance risk. For elevated freight and risk, premium mean operators still see opportunities. Operators may still enter the shadow fleet because it is highly lucrative and the risks are worth the reward. The result is therefore a slow but persistent drip of what's known as new tonnage into the shadows, often the same model used by other pariah states like Venezuela and Iran. And then you get a lot of second-hand sales that face tighter due diligence by authorities and compliance teams. So all in all, they do have the workarounds, but it becomes more and more risky and therefore potentially less profitable. And of course, there are ways to deal with this further. Sanction the companies that have any relations to these activities, right? Guilty by association can be a bit crude at times, but even the threat of potential sanctions can be enough of a deterrent. That is because the consequences of this leads to three main problems. One, obviously the environmental risk. Old uninsured ships are one accident away from a major spill with little accountability for cleanup. There was a disaster in 1989 known as the Exxon Valdez disaster, which, even with less oversight, the danger is not hypothetical. It can lead to catastrophic implications for people stuck in the middle and countries that have no desire to be part of these illicit activities. Of course, then, the second one is the illicit economies. A permanent shadow fleet market is emerging, not just a sort of peripheral thing, one that Russia and others like Iran can exploit long after the war in Ukraine fades from the headlines. China has already leveraged similar grey zone practices in areas like rare earth metals and transshipment of sanctioned goods, such as during the first Trump administration via Vietnam. And North Korea, well, infamous for its long use of covert tankers to skirt fuel bans. The worry is that Russia's scale now normalizes this model for bigger economies and basically makes it too big to fail. The third problem is sanctions leakage. Sanctions are an imperfect tool. The bigger they get, yes, they may be a bit more of a deterrent, but they're also harder to enforce in every single area. For example, America's Government Accountability Office has admitted that any shadow fleet has, quote, limited the cap's efficacy, keeping billions flowing into the Kremlin's war chest. And remember, every extra voyage to Asia is more costly, yet Moscow still accepts that premium because it's, well, better than the alternative. Proof that the sanctions are biting, not yet break. And it's not just oil. These techniques of deception, either fake signals, this flag hopping, covert transfers, could be applied to all forms of strategic goods in future conflicts, from grain and fertilizer to semiconductors, if we're thinking about a Taiwan scenario. In effect, therefore, sanctions designed to isolate may be teaching adversaries how to operate outside the Western system entirely, not just through bilateral use of local currencies, no longer the US dollar, for example, but also now in the maritime industry theatre. Lastly, though, what do you think about this? Are sanctions still? Now, of course, the West isn't blind to all this. The EU has listed more than 500 shadow fleet vessels. The UK, the US, Canada, and Australia are targeting these and trying to find ways to enforce the sanctions more effectively and reduce operational limits. But circumvention is like a whack-a-mole kind of scenario, right? Every time one tanker is sanctioned, another quietly joins the fleet elsewhere, and Russia will have to pay dearly to acquire them. So it does get more and more expensive, but it's also costly to sustain. And the attention being focused on this means it's not being focused perhaps more directly on development of weaponry or other means by which to defend against Russia's provocations in the Baltics. Another video that I made just recently, you can check out the channel. So cost isn't the same as collapse, basically. And Moscow has simply adjusted, treating sanctions not as a blockade, but as a surcharge. So looking ahead, the bigger danger is that this parallel economy doesn't just disappear when the war ends. Instead, it entrenches a network of illicit shipping that authoritarian states can lean on to challenge a Western dominance. Iran has survived this way for years. Venezuela still does it through obscure carriers. And now Russia, on a much larger and sophisticated scale, is building an infrastructure that China, India, and others are happy to tap into when they desire. So that's the long-term risk, a two-tier global system where Western-aligned economies trade by the rules, and others where shadow networks move energy and goods beyond oversight. Yet further erosion of the post-1945 order, and an illustration that countries that don't necessarily have the desire to listen to the requests or expectations of the West can do things their own way. This is why the shadow fleet matters far beyond Ukraine. It's not simply a Russian workaround, it could be the blueprint for a new age of sanctioned resilience, and ultimately which would weaken any tools that the United States or Western entities have left to, leverage. So while sanctions have slowed Russia, they've also spawned this shadow fleet. The question now is whether the West can adapt fast enough, close those loopholes, or whether there is, it's going to be a permanent feature of modern geopolitics. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on this rather, I think, fascinating angle. And if you don't know me, my name is Pyotr Kurzin. I'm a British Russian national who's grown up mainly in the West, but lived and studied across the Slavic area as well, in areas of international relations, economic statecraft, and strategic studies, including my master's from Johns Hopkins SAIS. If you appreciate what I'm trying to do with the channel, then, do consider subscribing and supporting me by sharing the videos or becoming a member. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the following videos as well. See you then. Take care.